Good morning, everyone. We want to thank you for attending today's NLPA webinar. Today, we will take a look at principles of demand management. All attendees will be in listen-only mode for the duration of this presentation. If you have any questions, please ask in the question box, and I will pose them to the presenter during the webinar as time allows. Now, I'm pleased to introduce you to today's presenter, Mr. Ron Crabtree. Ron is CEO of MetaOps Inc. and Meta Experts. He has over 30 years experience in organizational and business innovation and transformation, and along the way, more than 20 years in procurement and supply chain. He is an internationally recognized expert in cutting-edge business process improvement methodologies. Ron is a Master Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, having helped train and certify thousands of Lean Six Sigma and Six Sigma belts and driving hundreds of millions in value for clients. He is the author, co-author of 5 books on operational excellence. He has served as instructor for Villanova University and the University of San Francisco as a lead subject matter expert in Lean Six Sigma Green and Black Belt, Masters of Business Analysis, Supply Chain Management, and Lean Supply Chain. Ron has past and current certifications and expertise in numerous industry recognized trainings and is a developer of the Top Facilitator Program for Leaders of Organizational Transformation. Ron, thanks for joining us today as we all look forward to the presentation.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you very much. And I'd like to get started on this topic around the principles of demand management by sharing a story. And, early as a young man, I went to work right out of high school in manufacturing and corrugated box manufacturing company. And 3 years later, I was scheduling the whole plant without knowing any of this stuff you're going to learn today. And got to pick up some pieces. But I was very fortunate. I ended up moving to California for about 4 years, and I landed a job working for Walt Disney Company in their manufacturing division. So they actually had a manufacturing company at the time, and the sourcing and having supply was a big challenge for us. But we had this massive issue. This would have been about 1979, 1980 timeframe. And Disney had starting to ramp up all of the production to make the show and ride equipment for the Epcot Center that's in Florida that was opened in 1982. And at the same time, they had won a project, a joint project to develop and implement Tokyo Disneyland in Japan. So suddenly they went from like 500 people working at that site to 2,000. And we were ramping up to make all of the equipment. This would be vehicles, track, animated figures, sound equipment, controls. The whole thing had to be made to support Epcot and Tokyo Disneyland. And as we started to get into this, we began to recognize we had a significant problem with managing demand in the sourcing side, what we're trying to do, of course, in the process of making things. And it really came down to a lack of resources available to us to produce the show and ride equipment. And at that time in history, there were maybe 300 people on the planet that had the technical skills to actually build robotic figures, that would act out the story in the various attractions. And some of them that were, of course, on the Disney staff, but the others were scattered around with various suppliers. So we had a massive issue with constrained resources across our supply chain and for sourcing. So we actually were using computers, using program evaluation review technique with critical path method, 3 critical paths and all of that. And we actually loaded that up with all the capacity requirements and man months and man years for the kinds of resources we were going to need to actually build all this stuff on time. So we had to build all this out, a rather massive computerized program, and we were able to come up with a capacity constrained model and do a lot of what-ifing going back and forth. Well, if we delay this installation date here, we pull this one forward, can we move up design here? Can we get the artist to finish their work there so that we can move around where the demand would hit us so that we can affect level load over a 2.5, 3 year period of time, all of the sourcing that we needed to make on our suppliers to be able to produce all this show and ride equipment and actually have it for the customer, right, which was Disney themselves, on time. And that was like capacity requirements planning on steroids. It didn't lend itself to using material requirements planning because we really needed to zero in on the capacity side of it. And there were so many moving pieces, things affecting each other that would affect when we needed the equipment. We found that using advanced project management tool, program evaluation review technique was the answer. And that's kind of like the interesting story that companies deal with. But along the way, I personally work in corrugated box manufacturing, gas pumps, capital equipment like vehicles that are used in maintenance departments. Let's see, your satellite antennas, automotive suppliers. I worked in the automotive industry for close to 20 years, and then commercial goods and even consumer goods. So I've had the opportunity to sit in your chair through the years in many different industries, and then I've had the benefit of the Apex ASCM learning and certifications. Been through 5 enterprise resource planning implementations over the years in many different flavors of how you make this stuff happen. So I'm going to do the best I can here in this short time together to share with you some of the fundamentals of what the principles of demand management are for the sourcing professional. And we're going to have a polling question here coming up here in a couple of minutes. The other thing is I reached out to my network to kind of come up with who's doing what out there, right? So I kind of have a really good handle on the past, but I was interested in what's going on now. So in our webinar today, I'm going to share some little snippets and insights I was able to garner from several sources that I think you'll find pretty interesting. And at worst, I hope this will get you started on your journey to begin to master how we manage demand, particularly when it comes to how we get stuff done in sourcing. So I'm going to spend probably the first half of our time together really focusing in on the basics. What are the things you have to consider as you begin to understand your context for doing demand management properly? And then the balance of the webinar around planning it, what's the execution thing, what could that look like? And then getting an idea of how do you measure performance? How do you give yourself a performance review for your performance? And then KPIs, key performance indicators, and we'll get into a Q&A forum. We'd like to get started with a polling question, right? Because questions are good. We'll be providing copies of the presentation later, but questions are good. So we'd like you to use the polling tool, and I'd like everybody to weigh in on, just pick a value between 1 and 5 in terms of how you would rate your personal expertise around demand management. 1 as low as you go. I'm a novice. I know nothing about demand management. I get to learn something for the first time today. To a 5 is, Ron, be quiet. I should be teaching this because I'm a guru in supply chain and demand management. Would you just quickly use the polling tool and pop that up and participate and click one of those values? We'd like to see kind of where people are in our audience today. So please do that now. Amber, I'll let you comment as that comes together. Amber, how are we doing?
So Ron, so far we've got people coming in at levels 2 and 3.
All right, so we don't have a lot of novices, and they're kind of in that 2 and 3, clumping around the 2 and 3 value?
Yes, everyone 50-50 split at this time.
All right, awesome.
Oh, we've got a couple coming in at 4, so we're switching it up a little.
Okay, very good.
I'll give it another minute and then give you the totals.
All right, very good. So while that's happening, I built this program without knowing who was going to be here in terms of your orientation, whether you're more of a novice or more of a beginner, or maybe later further down the continuum. I'm getting the feel based on the values here that we're more closer to the novice and maybe have some experience and some exposure to demand management. So there's something in this webinar for everybody. If you're very much a novice, you're going to get a good foundation to start building on. If you're more advanced in your knowledge, I hope to share some elements and some aspects to demand management that will, get the gray matter going here a little bit, maybe offer a couple of ways of thinking about some of your challenges a little differently, perhaps than you've done in the past.
So at this point, Ron, we have 56% at level 2, 28% at level 3, and 17% coming in at level 4.
All right, awesome. I want to thank everybody for participating in the polling questions. Don't lose the tool because we have 3, not 1, not 2, but 3 more polling questions. I'm going to ask the audience to weigh in on where they see their organizations against 3 different questions coming up that all have a context within which we need to do demand management, particularly in the context of sourcing. So Amber, thank you. Good job for helping us with that. If you can take the polling tool down now, please. Or maybe I can do it. There we go. All right, awesome. So again, we'll provide copies of the presentation later, so you don't have to write everything down. We do have some quotes, some sources, where some of the stuff came from. So questions are good. Amber's going to be monitoring questions as we go, and I'll try to pause a couple of times along the way to see if there's a burning question we can handle. I will try to pace this to get through most of this in about a total of 45 minutes so that we can dedicate some time for Q&A at the end. If we handle a couple of questions along the way, we might stretch that to 50 and then switch to Q&A as well. All right, so let's move on now. Let's just get into some of the basics. And this is the source of this information here is a pretty good lengthy white paper with a lot of great graphics. I have a couple of them incorporated here. So what is demand management all about, right? It's balancing those customer requirements with our capabilities in the supply chain. And sourcing capability, or ability to source and have the right stuff at the right place at the right time, services and goods, critical. But I want to point out here that the process is not limited to just the forecasting. It really involves the other elements of synchronizing what we're doing across the supply chain, understanding what demand is going to be on our sources of supply, and then informing us about where we need to drive flexibility and reduce variability as well. So upside supply chain flexibility, or downside risk, upside downside risk, those kinds of things. I'll talk a little bit later as I introduce the SCOR, or Supply Chain Operations Reference Model, as a good best practice framework that we can rely on as we get deeper into this. So here's the high level SCOR framework. This stands for Supply Chain Operations Reference Model, originally developed by the Supply Chain Council, which is now merged with APICS, which has now been rebranded as the ASCM, Association for Supply Chain Management. And so these are like the key processes that occur. And for our audience, which is primarily, sourcing professionals of various kinds, we kind of sit here in this graphic. And if all we're going to be doing is buying stuff to use in the make process, and that's the end of it, this is pretty simple. But the reality is there's a massive planning thing we must be heavily involved with in understanding where we're going and what we're trying to accomplish as an organization, where's the growth coming from, what's going to change. And then our involvement may not end there, because we could in fact be sourcing for all the things we use in producing, but then what about delivery? Do we have partners that are going to help with aggregation of product, maybe consolidation and pushing it out to the end customers? Are we going to have returns? In other words, is this a product or service that's going to have a life cycle to it, and we're responsible for the backward flow into our suppliers for remanufacturing, recycling or recovery, or just plain handling of defects? So if there's a defective result at the end customer, can we route that back to our suppliers to deal with that? Well, that's all the things we have to grapple with as sourcing professionals when we think about what we're going to do to manage demand. It isn't necessarily just what we're going to be producing, right? So it's a little bigger than that. We're going to have a polling question here in a couple of minutes, but I want to introduce, again, using the SCOR process map here as a way of thinking about it, that each organization has these processes in it, but in reality, that's going to repeat as you move upstream, right, to your tier 1 suppliers, and then the tier 2 suppliers, tier 3, tier 4. It can keep going, out to your left. And then perhaps, there's downstream, right? We are a cog in the wheel of that total value delivery out to the end customer. And, we have repeating processes of, the whole planning and demand management thing that repeat over and over and over again. So I just wanted to socialize that for a minute, but I wanted to share this graphic. This came from that white paper I mentioned that I thought was quite helpful. And it's a little busy, but there's important things I'd like to, point out here that, help us understand the microcosm of what we're dealing with. Is, we might be sitting in the middle here, but ultimately you've got, purchasing is one of the key pillars of what needs to be done. We have a big impact typically in sourcing on logistics and the downstream part of it. And of course, we're supporting production. And it's our job typically really down inside of here around supplier relationship management, making sure we're developing suppliers that will be with us, not only today, but also help us be ready for the future and allow us to be nimble and agile and be able to respond to the changes in the market, maybe even bringing the suppliers in and having them be part of our development process to help us be successful. But we're going to do a polling question next. I'm going to flip to the polling question in a second. So I'm going to ask you to say, where are you and your organization in that end-to-end delivery of value, right? So think about it this way. If your organization and what you guys do is kind of sit in the middle, way upstream, we've got lots of raw material folks, mining it out of the ground, growing it in the field, creating the textiles or whatever it may be. We're kind of doing a core value add in the middle, but then we have downstream customers that will take what we produce and turn it into other products or aggregate it and then ultimately get out here. So I am curious, and we'll do the polling question. I'd like you to, we'll run that here in a second. For your organization, do you sit in the middle, or are you really out here toward the left or out here toward the right as kind of that last touch before the customer actually consumes that product, or in fact, are you the consumer of that finished item? So with that, let's jump to the polling question. And you plug a 1 if you're way out to the left, your company digs it out of the ground and grows it and harvests it, right? And gets it in the supply chain. Way out to the right, we're kind of the very last touch before the final consumption by the end customer. So I am curious, how our audience distributes across that continuum of where you are in the supply chain, because that definitely impacts the nature of demand and how we go about demand management. So
and I will say, if you've already submitted your answer, if you could resubmit that answer again.
All right, so we're waiting for those results to come in. Part of the reason I asked this question is I wanted to get a sense for, where does our audience clump up, at the beginning, the middle, or toward the end of this continuum, because I'd like to dial in some of the discussion to be more appropriate and germane to where you are in that continuum of supply and demand management in the entire value chain your industry is involved with. So part of the reason I wanted to do this one.
All right, and Ron, right now it looks like the majority at 76% or 78% now are right in the middle.
Okay.
With 16% being at middle left.
Okay.
And we've got 11% coming in at middle right. And the remaining 16% are answer E, which are we are the end consumer firm.
Ah, okay, cool. So at the very end of it, and basically as the consumer, you have to somehow send signals upstream to everybody else. And then you are consuming and sourcing things for your own operations as well. Oh, thank you for sharing the graphic. Mm-hmm. Cool, very cool. All right, awesome. So we're kind of like middle left or toward the middle. So thank you. That kind of gives me a sense for the majority of the audience, and I'll try to tailor the rest of this discussion with that in mind. So Amber, thank you. Good job on that. All right, then let's move on. Then we'll have another polling question coming up here in a moment. Courtesy of the SCOR framework, we're actually going to talk about, what are the processes involved, and this would represent what's defined in the supply chain operations reference model as key plan processes. You have the high level where you plan the entire end-to-end supply chain, and then for this audience, this is kind of our sweet spot. Identify sourcing, aggregating requirements, prioritize, aggregate all the resources required to support what we need, balancing those resources, and then establishing the plans for how we're going to source. And you have to do the demand management piece before you can actually think about how you want to manage the sourcing downstream. And then you'll note you got planning for make, planning for deliver, and planning for return. So I wanted to reemphasize, depending on the nature of the value add your company does, and since most of the folks here are early or in the middle of the supply chain, you probably have to, as a sourcing professional, you probably have a dog in the fight for all of this planning, not just internal to the sourcing itself, but also providing inputs to the bigger plan for the enterprise, but then supporting the make part of what your organization does. But oh, by the way, what about fulfillment? So we definitely would have some concern about, after we hand it off to that last two steps in the supply chain going out toward the customer, are we going to be part of that delivery and having to source and be involved with how we're going to get those products and services delivered to the end customers? And are we going to have to worry about the return loop for reuse, repair? In the aircraft industry, they call it rotables, right? So we actually have components in the aircraft that would rotate back to the OEM for rebuilding and rotate back into the aircraft as part of the standard operating procedure. And that has to all be managed in the sourcing plan and can create a lot of complexity. In fact, I'll share a little balanced scorecard based on the aircraft parts industry toward the end of the webinar, just to illustrate some of the things that we're covering here. All right. So next up, here's the next big thing that is important when it comes to demand management is what's the nature of demand for your organization. So the SCOR framework, again, a useful place to start, and what are the types of supply chains are involved with. So we have what are called stock or make to stock type environments, right? We're replenishing inventory, we have standard materials, we have very high fill rates, we have some inventory issues to worry about, but we're kind of a make to stock or replicate the same thing over and over again. Versus make to order, meaning I'm not going to stock it until I actually have the customer order. So there's going to be hybrids where we'll, in the sourcing plan, we'll stock certain items that we would convert into product once we get the orders. We would have inventory in our system in anticipation of getting the customer orders. And this is where material requirements planning, enterprise resource planning systems can be pretty robust to help us come up with, okay, here's the orders we think we're going to get. Let's use some kind of forecast to generate a plan for sourcing and having all the right stuff in the pipeline, a certain amount of inventory, a certain amount of capacity that's already planned. And then when the order actually manifests, then we consume it. They call it forecast consumption is the fancy jargon. We consume it and we try to manage that and make sure we're not over consuming or under consuming too much and creating problems in our sourcing management strategy. And then of course you have engineer to order, which is the most difficult and the longest lead times. So if we're going to design it, then we got to source it, right? So you got the customer requirements, we understand what the customer really wants, and then and only then can we really complete the sourcing cycle. And again, you could have a hybrid. There could be certain items that go into the products you produce that you can have them in the pipeline as a stock but not yet converted status, or you're going to have a lot of stuff you're going to source on a to order as the customer buys it in an engineered order environment. So I'm going to ask a polling question here in a minute to see how our audience stacks up against these types of supply chains, because it has an impact on how you have to tackle demand management from a sourcing perspective. I added this one down here called retail supply chain type. And retail is probably true since we've got some folks at the end of this 18% of the audience really out toward the end. They may be more of a retail type organization selling directly to the end customers. So it can be a real hybrid. So if you're in the retail space, you could have a real hybrid with elements of all this stuff in play, right? It's going to be very much a make to stock or stocking in anticipation of demand, but you have a couple of things working that make it more difficult. One would be, particularly if you're involved with the holiday season, products that are sold typically around the Christmas holidays in North America. He said, for many retail organizations, 60% of sales for the whole year occur in 90 days time or less. And that's something that has to be really carefully managed. If you're in the foods, particularly fresh foods and the like, I was just recently working with a company that harvests fruit from the field, right, and gets it into the retail stores to be sold. Well, massive headaches around, okay, so how do we plan to have the packaging for picking the product and packing it in the field at the right place at the right time in conjunction with our end consumer and customer requirements? Big nightmare, because it's a very seasonal thing, product, fruit, different things maturate at different speeds. And that creates all kinds of real headaches and challenges when it comes to demand management that are more associated with the retail supply chain type. So now we'll go ahead and get to the polling question. What I'd like you to do here, there's going to be 5 choices. We're mostly make to stock, we're mostly make to order, we're mostly engineer to order, or I'll give you an extra choice here. We're actually a mixture, we're a hybrid. We have 2 or more of these types that we need to deal with every day. Let's take a crack at the polling question. I want to get a feel for, do we have a convergence in the audience, or if people are spread out on this one? So please take a crack at the polling question now.
Ron, it looks like the majority of our attendees are a mixture of 2 or more of these types, answering E. Secondly would be A at make to stock.
Okay.
And then B at 20% make to order, 10% coming in at engineer to order, and then retail is at 15%.
15% retail. Okay, that's consistent with the other polling question.
Mhm.
So retail is 15%. All right. So the biggest one was basically a mixture, followed by make to stock is the next biggest one, make to order, engineer to order, and then retail. Okay, very good. Thank you. So the fact is, for most companies, and you're not alone, this audience is pretty typical for, particularly for larger organizations. Now, in the automotive supply chain, which I know very well, living in Detroit and having worked in that industry, many of the suppliers are like, captive in-house, and they basically just supply the same parts over and over again throughout the life cycle of the various model years of the cars. They have a pretty simple problem when it comes to demand management. And I'll talk more about where it's not so simple in that space later with a case study. But most of us in the reality have, complexity. We can't pick just one method for demand management. One size doesn't fit all. We have to have the ability to understand product by product or service by service that we need to handle these things differently based on the profile of how that happens, right? So we'll get to another polling question here in a minute, but this was another graphic from that white paper that I cited earlier that I found was helpful. Is in our demand management processes, it's really important that we understand the nature of demand, but you have to drive down into the actual product or service that we're providing to customers. Because frankly, there's no one size fits all solution for demand management. It doesn't exist. The fact is, we probably have to have multiple methods for managing demand in play for any given organization at all times. So if we look at this, and we're going to do a multi-vote here, polling question shortly to kind of pick out which of these quadrants your organization is most likely to be in. So quadrant one is, pay attention here, we have low to high on demand variability on the left. So it's the variability, the volatility, the amount of change that will happen within your lead time to respond is very low, or it's very, very high. It's just all over the place. I can't predict it, et cetera, et cetera. And then out to the right-hand side, we have demand volume. So as volumes go up, if I'm low variability but high volume, this would be a classic tier one automotive supplier sitting over here. And I worked in that industry for many, many years. If you are an organization that produces stuff after you get the customer order, if it's low volume, you could be sitting up here. If it's extremely high volume, it could be pushing you up into quadrant 4. If you have both high variability and high demand, you are really going to be out here in that upper right-hand quadrant where you need lots of people to be involved, right? So down here, we can use data-driven forecasts in the automotive industry that will give you, 13 weeks of visibility. They'll give you, 8, 12 weeks of material authorization, maybe 4 weeks of fabrication authorization. They'll update that every week. You know what they're building for the cars. You can pay attention to what's being sold in the end market, anticipate changes in demand, and you can basically get by with basic spreadsheets, just something pretty simple. I can use the forecast, I can use the historical shipments data, and I can kind of automate the demand management process. Very much so, we have low variability in demand. We can use some pretty simple tools, and I'll describe a couple of those later. But as you move up into this make to order area where I can't do anything until the customer actually orders it, I might be doing a whole bunch of demand planning and stocking up my inventory and having things in the system ready to go. But my complexity and the demand on me in the make to order environment is much, much different. And then if we got everything against us, then we are likely to be up here. At the very end of the toward the very end of the webinar, I'm going to share a graphic that would demonstrate best practice that seems to be out there today around the reality of what people need to do from a demand management perspective if they're out here in this quadrant. So let's just do the polling question now. So if you just imagine, like everybody to kind of weigh in, which of these quadrants do you think is the best fit generically for where your organization sits? Probably you're a mix. In fact, we know mixed is the biggest component. So maybe you plug a number. I ask you to pick one of these 4 values, right? We're down in that bottom left-hand quadrant. We're over here. We're up here. We're over here. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. So we can go ahead and run the polling question now, please.
And Ron, it appears that the majority of our attendees are in quadrant 4 at high variability, high volume at 55%.
55%?
Yes.
Okay. And what's the next biggest one?
There'll be number 3, high variability, low volume at 35%.
Wow. Okay.
Next would be quadrant 1, low variability, low volume at 10%.
Okay.
And then coming in last is low variability, high volume at 5%.
All right. That's kind of what I was expecting based on what, some of the earlier answers we had from folks, with the mixed type of supply chains. Let's see here, and some retail involved too. So the retail folks, because one retail organization can have all types of supply chains. They can have stuff they actually make to the customer order. They can have stuff they won't order it and get it into the supply chain until the customer actually orders it, or if they sell them every day, and they could be doing all 3 types in a retail model in their delivery of goods to customers. So the reality is we have to face all of those things. So all of that's very helpful. And we're about 30 minutes in and pretty much on track with where I wanted to be at this point. So thank you for bearing with me here. All right, so the fact is, planning demand and demand management process is not simple. And the amount of rigor and the data you need to feed it is really depending on your situation. And that's what we've learned a lot about for this audience, kind of what are some of the situations we're in. Where are we in that end-to-end supply chain? How are we going to get information, and who do we need to feed that to, and what's our role in managing demand? What type of supply chain are we in? What are the tools and methods we need to use there? And then the nature of volatility that we need to deal with. So most of our audience is in the more difficult part, the more challenging aspect of how we manage demand. And then there's one more element. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but there's this notion of maturity within the enterprise in terms of our maturity and our ability to do this really, really well. So this is leveraging the Gartner model. This is a slide I borrowed from my buddy Paul with his execution playbook. I'll have another slide later with a sample scorecard. But Gartner's done a great job of just helping to describe, managing the maturity of demand-driven enterprise. And, stage 1, early stage, every business unit operates on their own. There's very little interoperability and managing of demand so that we can drive sourcing across the enterprise from a single source. So sourcing all has to be done business unit by business unit down here. And then you move into stage 2, where we begin to align functions under the business units so that we can get better alignment. And then stage 3. So as a practical matter, the vast majority of organizations, based on the data I've seen, probably exist somewhere right about in here on the maturity, and really should be moving toward or aspiring toward moving up into something more like stage 5, where we've aggregated the demand for the business units into a single planning point for managing demand across all of our business units, really getting at driving better value, of balancing supply with demand, and then the actual products and services we're bringing into play. And then really out here at the pinnacle of it, and I'll have a slide to illustrate what that could look like in terms of the planning model, is true network value, where we've got the ability with artificial intelligence, sensing devices, point of purchase transactions, all kinds of data that we can use to drive real network value across all the trading partners to the ultimate customer. So your reality is your organization probably lives in one of these buckets, but we didn't have time for another polling question. I'm going to guess that a lot of us here today are kind of in here right now, aspiring to move up here, but we'll talk more about that later. All right, so now we're going to segue and talk just for a couple of minutes about the actual demand planning process. Since we have so many people in the room, I think we said we were level 2 or level 3 in terms of our knowledge about demand management. So I'm going to guess most of us are conversant with these pieces. But the reality is it kind of flows in a natural process, right? We need to get data to feed the demand modeling. And that typically comes from history, or we've got forward-looking things based on what's been sold and what we anticipate to be sold. Ideally, we're kind of leveraging both, right? Historically, what's actually happened, so that we can learn from that and inform our forecasting for demand, for ultimate sourcing. And then what are we seeing coming down the pike? What are the innovations that are coming? Are there new suppliers coming into the market? Are there suppliers that are exiting? Do we need to develop a supplier of the future? I mean, those kinds of things, and begin to give that thought. And then moving through with the first crack at what a statistical view of demand is going to be in future periods. and then moving into the modification of this. And this is typically data gathering, data cleansing, getting the data into a place we can work with it. And then we get a human being involved. And then that human being needs to start grappling with what we've talked about here. What's the nature of the demand for that product? And then which are those products, et cetera? And are we in that make to order, engineer to order, make to stock? Are we in a hybrid? Do we have to do all three? Do we need to partition our demand planning into buckets based on the profile of the nature of demand, the volatility of demand, the type of supply chain we are, and where we sit in that hierarchy of value going out to the end customer? From there, we got to make sure we've gathered all the forward-looking stuff. And one of the things I'd like to mention, a big challenge for us in sourcing, we need to be really cozy with marketing and sales folks and also our engineering folks in this demand modeling process, because a couple of things are going to go on. Well, one is there's the product life cycle. In other words, the product has been introduced, it's ramping up, it's mature, and now it's going to fall off in its demand in the future. We need to really understand the product life cycle. And then the other piece is what I call engineering change notice or engineering change management. That's what ECN means here in the slide. We got to really understand which of these products or services we're going to be sourcing are subject to significant risk from a change perspective on our part. In other words, we're going to be making changes in the design specification, forcing our suppliers to do something different. And believe it or not, you've got the flip side of it, aircraft parts. Great example. The OEMs that produce major components that go into aircraft are continually changing things. And with one company I've worked with, they had the headache in their sourcing department of, wait a minute, I bought this aircraft 10 years ago, but the parts that I'm going to be fixing this aircraft with in maintenance repair operations have undergone 12 significant engineering changes that had nothing to do with me. It was all generated by the OEMs that make the parts. So now I got all these issues about what can I replace? Can I replace what with what? And if we replace this with this new design, what else is going to change in the envelope affecting my sourcing decisions? That is quite a challenge, okay? So that's why I want to make sure we really understand that. Is here you really begin to lay out your plan horizon. Do I have a pretty short cycle if I'm making, consumer electronics or toys, things that turn very quickly? A 3 to 6 month horizon's got to be pretty tight because it's going to change so quick anyway. Planning beyond that isn't that helpful. Or can I go 60 months out? I'm producing capital equipment. It has very low engineering change rates, like mining equipment, agricultural equipment tends to be pretty stable, has pretty good long life cycles. So the longer the life cycle of your product and the less the engineering change risk you're going to encounter, then the further out you can go and really do demand planning and then begin to share that and shape, shape your decisions around supplier development, what kinds of commitments you can make to your suppliers in exchange for vendor managed inventories, lower inventories, just in time, blah, 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 pay as built, other things we can do to drive value for our organization and for our ultimate customers. And then down inside of that is, okay, now we got to work through the true feasibility of this and get through what I call X-function or cross-functional collaboration. Again, we got to sit down, okay, let's talk to engineering again and make sure we understand what's coming down the pike. Let's talk to sales and marketing. What's coming up down the pike for new products and services? Are we far enough out in front of that from a planning perspective? Let's see here. What if analysis, and this is a really good one. And this is the point where in our sourcing and demand planning, we need to be talking about, so if things went really well and sales did knock it out of the park, what's that look like? If competition enters the market that we didn't expect and our demands don't happen, what's that downside look like? And then from a demand planning perspective, particularly in sourcing with our suppliers, we got to make sure they're able to deal with that, both the upside and the downside in our planning for demand and in development of suppliers and their capabilities. And then finally, you can't forget about accounting. You need to make sure this ties back to your annual operating plan. Do we have the money in the budget to do all this stuff? Can we do these things we want to do and make sure we tie out the policies and all those procedures? Well, it'll take an hour just to begin to peel the onion on how all this actually works, and we're not going to. But I wanted to introduce this concept, and at the end of the webinar, we're going to ask everybody to offer up their suggestions and requests. You can start thinking about that now. In future webinars, we're going to cover quite a bit here today, but it's kind of like getting you a little framework. And if there's particular subject matter around demand management you want to dig into, we're going to ask you to share that with us at the end of the webinar. All right. Here's a different view of the same thing. So this one here is just kind of cascades. I got this from one of our partners, and I thought this was kind of cool. This actually fits pretty well the model the majority of folks in our audience are dealing with here. They're high variability, high volume, different kinds of supply chain in play, and I'm kind of in the middle of the supply chain. So if we look here, there's all kinds of little pieces here that really, I just thought this was a nice graphic to kind of walk it out from left to right. These are all the inputs, marketing, sales, forecasting, distribution planning, fulfillment, all of that, and moving through what they call consensus forecasting. And this is, by the way, a best practice that if you aren't formally doing this as an organization, this is something you need to be moving toward pretty quickly, is coming up with a way to actually do this and then use that to build out, how you're going to actually manage your demand going forward with how are you going to measure your performance, how are you going to give yourself feedback, how are you going to react to that, and of course, what are you going to do to make sure you achieve your forecast, whatever that may be, in terms of price, on-time delivery, volumes, and all those other aspects. So I thought this was helpful. All right, so I'd like to share a case study. How are we doing here on time? Okay, I think we can share this case study. So what do you do if you have something that's unplannable, meaning there's no history, there's no way to forecast it? What do you do now, right? So I'm going to share, the real story of something that we came up with a solution for that many years ago, but it's a basic method that I think everybody on this call, if you haven't tried it or looked into it, could be a good solution. So here was the challenge I had. I was working for United Technologies Automotive. We were producing headliners that go into the upper roof and vehicles for different OEMs. And they would give us, the typical forecast of, colors, shapes, and the models that these things would go in. But we had this real problem, and we had returnable containers. So the typical practice in the automotive tier ones is to try to put returnable containers into the supply chain so that companies like United Technologies Automotive could make the parts, put it in a returnable container in the order to be used. It'd go to the assembly plant, they would use it, consume it, and then they would route the container back to us. And then we put the parts in, rinse and repeat, right? So we're not having expendable corrugated to throw away, all the dunnage, all these issues. But we had a problem, is we also had to have on hand and manage consumable packaging, corrugated boxes, pallets, inserts, so that we could pack these stuff in boxes versus returnables for several reasons. One is service parts. So if we're going to be shipping to service parts, I couldn't use a returnable container because we couldn't have those containers tied up sitting in the service center for the next 5 years. So service parts would always be packaged in expendable packaging. Those orders would come and go with no rhyme or reason. You get a load of orders at the beginning of the year to kick off the model year, and then maybe nothing, or have stuff get pummeled with demand for stuff for service parts. Then we had the issue of, the assembly plant got a little tied up in their yard. They forgot to send us the returnables, right? So we're out of returnables. My factory is running crazy 7 days a week in one case. It's 24 hours a day to keep up with demand. And I run out of returnables. I was like, come on, you've got to have this expendable packaging on hand. So if everything went south, it was a snowstorm, I couldn't get this stuff, we had to turn on a dime and be able to produce all of our volume into expendable packaging. And then we had a third problem of engineering changes. So if we needed to make changes to the tooling, we needed to do a major PM on the equipment, we may not have much time planned for that, and then we'd have to, in effect, build a bank of inventory, a large advance inventory to get in front of demand, so we could keep shipping to the automotive plants. By the way, not shipping on time in full isn't one of the choices in the automotive industry, unless you're like chartering DC-9s, which I got to do as well, but another story for another day. So how do you plan for all that? I mean, there's no way to forecast it. The volume can be zero for months, and then boom, you get hammered. So what do you do? And corrugated waste pallets will rot in the yard. So the strategy we came up with was a pull system. And what we did is we said, okay, let's do the worst case scenario. If everything we're going to produce suddenly needed to be in expendable packaging, how much of that would I consume within the lead time it takes to replenish it? And I had a sawmill down the road. This is a true story, sawmill down the road. These guys would harvest the lumber and cut it up and make the pallets. It only took them 72 hours to respond and begin producing pallets at the rate I would actually need. So we went out in the yard We created footprints out in the parking lot with stacks of the different kinds of pallets that represented 3 days consumption at full volume for the plant. And how the process worked is every day, one of my fork truck drivers would do a cruise through the parking lot with a little checklist, and they would make a little X on the empty spots. We'd fax it to the supplier. They would make the pallets. The next day they would deliver them. They would observe what wasn't there, and so it became a self-replenishing inventory within the lead time with just that pile. So I never had more than I could reasonably use in a short time, and we were using first in, first out so they didn't rot. We have the same problem with the corrugated boxes. So this is the outside box, the parts would go in, and any dunnage and corner posts and all that stuff made it corrugated. And then the lead time for the corrugated folks was running about 6 weeks at that time. So, okay, well, I can't wait, I can't be down for 6 weeks. So we worked out a system where we maintain about a 3-week inventory at our plant. We got the corrugated suppliers to agree to maintaining about a 3-week inventory on their side that I could pull on. And then we set it up with a daily checklist, and we'd go through and we would count unbroken bundles. We would count unbroken bundles, meaning the straps were still on them. And that would turn into a replenishment trigger for the suppliers. They always had that demand coming to them with about a 6-week buffer. With that system, we never had more than, worst case scenario, 6 weeks supply committed. And if suddenly, boom, I need to produce nothing but in returnables for the next 2 or 3 months, we could survive that while something was happening. Okay, so simple technique. I've got some spreadsheets with how to do that. I'd be happy to share those if requested. It's just a simple little Excel spreadsheet for looking at demand, thinking about the issues, and coming up with how to size basically this kind of situation. It's called pull system or Kanban approach, if you haven't heard of that. All right, so when it comes to executing demand management, right, you've got 3 basic buckets, right? It's the simple, it's pretty easy to see what's coming. We've got good data. We can use Kanbans. We can use consumption-based triggers within lead time to pull stuff through. That can be pretty good. I'm going to guess that you do have stuff that would be appropriate for this. But back to the one-size-fits-all, based on what I learned about the audience here, you probably have all 3 conditions here. There's stuff you can plan that's real simple. This would be things like supply, maintenance supplies, things you use and consume, basic packaging, that kind of stuff maybe lends itself to a simple method. Then you've got the next layer down of make to order, engineer to order, where you're using classic MRP, ERP. You have reasonably good forecast data. You can create planning bills. You can extrapolate that into a demand plan for your suppliers and do pretty well. Or you could be in a very advanced situation. It sounds like we do have folks in this seat in the audience where you need to have really dynamic types of planning available to you. So here's a picture of what that could look like. This is courtesy of 09 Solutions. These guys are working with the big boys. And this is an eye test, I admit it, and that's why we'll certainly be happy to send you a copy of the presentation so you can look closer. You can also go out to their website and find this too. But look at what the big boys are doing, right? You've got demand planners sitting up here kind of in the middle of this. This would be you, but you've really got all this stuff going on, right? You've got the enterprise planning going on. You have your annual operating plan, all the stuff going on there. But then the nuance, which artificial intelligence, having sensors in the field, the way to capture point of purchase consumption, all these things are becoming easier and easier to do with the Internet of Things and the interoperability of information. And so all of this is becoming somewhat automated. So there's engines out there that we still have to sit in the middle of as demand planners and think critically about where we're going, what's the supply or sourcing look like for the future, and then how are we going to manage our upside downside risks and get within the cost targets, right? And the quality targets and the delivery and inventory targets that we need to manage to. So there's a lot of good stuff in here, and you can come back to this and dig into it. You've got Internet of Things, what they call edge application interface devices. You got real-time and batch API interfaces, natural language image processing, this is artificial intelligence, computer learning, all these things are starting to really become available to us from a demand planning perspective. So this is probably the most cutting edge, state-of-the-art picture of how you can go at the problems that we're talking about in today's webinar. All right, so let's talk a couple of other things, and we'll get into some Q&A here and stuff. So, we'll talk about performance review. How are we going to manage and monitor performance? I would revert back to the supply chain operations reference model. Yeah, tons, I forgot now, over 130, 180 or something like that, almost 200 different kinds of predefined metrics, many of which we would leverage in sourcing. So just take a looking at these. These are the externally facing attributes to performance and SCOR, internally facing. These are the attributes here, and then these are what are called the level 1 types of metrics. So for us, sourcing, for our suppliers, supplying my make and all my downstream, I'm looking for perfect order fulfillment, right? I'm looking for short cycle times to respond, this upside, downside flexibility and adaptability. I need to understand my total cost of ownership, right? When I'm doing sourcing, I can't worry about the price I'm paying. I've got to think about everything associated with buying, owning, and consuming and delivering that good or service through its entire life cycle. It's not just the price. So that total supply chain management cost needs to be understood, managing our cash, making sure we're getting return on our inventory assets, et cetera, et cetera. This is pretty robust stuff. And then inside of the SCOR framework, you've got levels of diagnostics. So you've got highest level up here, right? This would be a 1.1 at the high level, but inside of that, you have other metrics, right? Perfect order fulfillment being in there, and then you've got deeper level diagnostics. So think about down in here, you're getting to more leading indicators, things you can look at every day and pay attention to. They will give you a signal for how are we doing against our bigger performance indicators, and how well is our demand management actually working. There's lots of prescribed things here. You don't have to invent it from scratch. Fortunately for you, within the SCOR framework, they've aligned the types of metrics with the type of supply chain. So there's specific metrics and best practices associated with engineer to order versus make to order versus make to stock and retail that you can leverage. You don't have to invent this stuff from scratch. It's available to us, okay? Quick case study, and then we'll get into Q&A here in another moment. This is an actual balanced scorecard that worked with a company to develop in the aircraft parts industry, borrowing this from the execution playbook template. Here again, we've got the attributes of performance here. Not shown here because I had to squeeze this for today's discussion is, what were the priorities and what have you. But this is where you move through and understanding how you want to perform in your sourcing. Do you want to be better, the same, or worse than your competitors? Which attributes you want to focus on. But inside of here, particularly for the aircraft folks, there's a ton of pretty good stuff in here, like source cycle time. In other words, when I have an internal need to source this item in aircraft parts, it's okay, it's going to replace this other part. Now I need to source it. How long does it take for us to actually get it sourced? That's a really important metric deep down inside sourcing that we need to be paying attention to. And then once we source it, what's the response time, right, from the supplier to actually begin to provide it once I've sourced it? Those are pretty good, deep down in the weeds kind of metrics that will make a real difference to us. So again, you'll be able to get the slides and do a little deeper dive if you want to take a closer look at this. And then there's, again, leveraging the SCOR framework pretty heavily, and then some unique attributes that had to be created specifically in this situation. All right. So we'll get into wrap up here. So if you're an organization that's really getting new to this or wanting to figure out how to get to that next level, right? You want to reduce your risk of failure, develop your people, right? That's what Next Level Purchasing Association is all about, is providing the resources to develop sourcing professionals. If you want to drive real value, then we got a couple of things you could think about. We have what we call the one-day free appraisal. Well, it's not free. There'd be some expenses for somebody to travel, but we'll send somebody in to help sit down with you guys and take a look at what's going on, expenses only, and help you understand what's possible when it comes to some of the challenges you're up against. We just ask to get that scheduled by the end of the month and complete it before the end of September. That, of course, has some significant value. Or we can do what we call the think tank, and we can pull together a couple, 3 people maybe, people like me and people from some of these organizations I've mentioned today that can sit on the phone with you and with your team and just kind of think this through and start understanding, what are some of the options and trade-offs and opportunities for you as an organization. Again, no charge. Again, we don't get that scheduled by the end of the month, conduct it by the end of the year. So we'd like to encourage you to take advantage of that. All right, so again, you can choose one of the two, the one day or the think tank. And there's a link here that you can use to get on my calendar to talk about that. So with that, here's what we covered, right? What is all this that we got to be concerned about? And basically, what's the process? How do we execute that? And how do we give ourselves feedback and control it? So I'm going to take a breath and have a sip of water here. And Amber has a question and a request for the audience.
Great job, Ron. That was very informative. I hope everyone took away as much as I did. So guys, just wanted to check in, see what our interests are for the next webinar. This is a big topic, and it's not possible to delve deeply into all the aspects of demand management in the short amount of time that we have. So use your question tool now to share what you'd like to dive into a little deeper. Let us know what you think would be the next best suited topic, or a suite of topics that we could dive deeper into for the next several presentations that we have. So it's open, and just let us know, and then we'll share those and discuss them within our team before we make our next, before we have our next presentation.
Right. Good job. So we'll let people work on that. In the meantime, while they're doing that, are there any particular questions that popped up that we might want to try to tackle now?
No, actually, believe it or not, you've done such a great job with this presentation. We don't have a lot of questions. So it's just open for any that come in. So now's the time to pose any questions that you may have that you've thought of in the last few minutes or during the presentation that you want Ron to take a stab at.
And if we can't handle them today, we'll try to make note of those and see if we can address some of those questions in the next webinar as well,
Yeah.
depending on what comes through.
Mm-hmm. We've got a few more minutes, guys, so if you've got anything that you want to send in, be sure to send it in now. And again, a copy of the presentation along with the recorded webinar will be available for all attendees. So we'll send that out by the end of this week. Ron, it doesn't look like we have any questions today, but if the topics come in, I'll share those with you and David so we can determine what the next best suited webinar topic will be. Thank you all for attending, and Ron, thanks for another fabulous job. We appreciate everything.
Thank you, Amber.
Bye, everyone.